Okay, 10:01. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues, and welcome to this workshop on reimagining context and concepts of African development. The workshop is being hosted by the Lagos African Cluster Center that is based at the Institute of African Diaspora Studies at the University of Lagos. Quickly, I will invite the director of the center, who also doubles as the director of the institute, Professor Muyiwa Falaye, to give us the welcome remarks. Over to you, Prof.
Well, thank you, Professor Lawansin. Good morning, everyone. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to this very important workshop. I speak this morning on behalf of the Dean of the Cluster, Professor Rudiger Zisman, who is unavoidably absent due to very pressing issues. I also want to commence by commiserating with the Cluster family on the loss of one of us, Richard Anya, a doctoral student who passed on last week. I particularly would like to commiserate with Dr. Cassandra McPherson, who is here present. It's a huge loss for the Cluster family, and may I humbly request we observe a moment's silence in respect of this young budding scholar in African studies, who incidentally is also of Nigerian origin, and we will then continue with the program in a few moments. Thank you very much. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let me formally welcome to the Institute of African and Diaspora Studies, University of Lagos, and the Lagos African Cluster Center. Lagos African Cluster Center is one of the 4 centers in the cluster system led by the University of Bayreuth. The cluster system is called African Multiple Cluster of Excellence in African Studies. One of our programs today is the workshop on African development. This workshop is part of a larger project. Some of you will recall that a few months ago, we had a documentary on the concepts and conceptualizations of African development. For those of you who have not seen this documentary, I'm going to urge you after this workshop to go look at that documentary. It's available on YouTube. The 2 researchers in charge of this project will send the link to you before the end of this project, of this workshop, so you can see the documentary. I see the documentary as a prolegomena to this workshop. So if you have not seen this documentary, you'll be doing yourself a disservice not seeing it before today's workshop. But you can still see it before tomorrow's program. It's important that you listen and watch that workshop. For this morning, we are going to be served a very rich menu, given the kinds and pedigree of the scholars that have been invited to lead to this workshop. I used to know Dr. Tade Akin-Aina as a student at the University of Lagos very many years ago. I remember as an undergraduate, Dr. Tade Akin-Aina was one of those lecturers who would do anything for to attend his lectures. But that was about 30-something years ago, very long ago. But he's still here, active, and still very, very prominent in the scholarship circuit. I welcome, with all respect to today's workshop, my former teacher, Dr. Tade Akin-Aina, who is a keynote for today. And I'm sure that many people who are here are seriously looking forward to a wonderful presentation from Dr. Tade Akin-Aina. We also have, unfortunately, we will not be having Professor Innocent Masindo, who at the last minute had to attend to other pressing issues. I hope if things work out well, it might just join us at the tail end of this presentation. But we're going to have Dr. Cassandra McPherson herself, and who I know is still mourning, but I'm glad she's able to put some of these things at the back burner for now and still join us in today's presentation. I'm indeed happy, excited to have you, Cassandra, and it was also nice meeting you in Freiburg a few days ago. Again, we will have Dr. Akin-Aina, who is more or less part of the family here. Dr. Akin-Aina is from the Center for African Studies, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. It's nice to see you, always nice to have you. And of course, we know that if anyone is competent to discuss this matter, it is Akin-Aina. So we have a strong team, a strong field that will lead this discussion. And finally, let me again thank Professor Lawansin and Dr. Eleshi for always putting together programs like this, for making the Lagos African Cluster proud with the kinds of programs and events that they arrange. And let me thank all of you who have also had time to join us this morning. I know we are all busy doing one or two things, but it's important for us to interrogate the concept of development in Africa. What does development mean to us in Africa? Do you have a universal concept, or should we have a universal concept of development? Should there be a direction, a trajectory that development in Africa should take? We all know that the concept itself is elusive, multifaceted, and all of that, but then we must still agree as some common denominator that development must have. At this point, I want to welcome you to this event and pray that you'll be patient and go through all of this today and all of that tomorrow. At the end of the day, we'll have something worthwhile to present as the outcome of this workshop. I hand over again to the two organizers, Professor Lawansin and Dr. Abisoye Eleshi, to continue with the program. Welcome everyone to Lagos, even if virtually.
Thank you very much, Prof. And incidentally, it is indeed Lagos. We've been stuck in traffic for a few years, but for a few hours actually, but the work must go on. So very quickly, I would just like to do a quick presentation on the reason why we are here. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So why reimagine African development? The outline of the presentation is just 3. Why do we need to reimagine? A few pointers from the projects that we did last year that has led to where we are now, and then how can we reimagine African development? And then we'll hand over to our veteran, Professor Tade Akin-Aina, to share with us from his wealth of experience. We find that African development is usually premised on contested interests, especially of political and economic elites, of governments, international development agencies, and the people. Oftentimes, there's a disjuncture between the interests of the people and the interests of the other parties that I stated earlier. There's also a faulty premise that modernization is development, whereby we are perennially searching for the elusive world-class city, world-class country, or world-class indicator of progress or achievement. As many African countries are, post-colonial, there is also a lot of dependency on the colonial framings of knowledge production, of wealth creation, and even of social identities. And we continually struggle with that. Who is a true African? Who is a real African? What kind of knowledge is valid? What kind of knowledge is not? And what are the narratives that we should believe? What is being produced? What is being documented? Indeed, what are our histories? What is our present? And what really is the future of Africa in the line of that? We see that the global development agenda is based often on an understanding of life in the global north, and that this understanding is touted as the universal ideal. And this essentially neglects the African experience and the African voice where things do not align. Okay, so in 2021, we carried out a study on what does African development mean to Africans. And what we did was to do an assessment, an online survey of Africans in Africa and on the diaspora. We were able to do a survey with 73 online participants and street-based interviews with 40 people in Lagos, in Accra, Accra, and in Nairobi. We interviewed 68 men, 32 women, and about 80% of our respondents are based on the continent, and others in the diaspora, specifically in Canada, in Germany, in the US, in China, and in the UK. And 64% of our diasporic respondents had spent at least 10 years abroad. We find that in the definitions of African development, there was a general consensus across our respondents that there are varying meanings of Africa development. Many of them, confirm that these definitions vary across disciplines, and that oftentimes the meanings of the definitions can be contradictory. We speak particularly of economists. While some economists see development as freedom, others see development as a constraining of rights. It also varies across locations, as we see that Africans in different cities consider development to be different things. And those who are based abroad also have a slightly different understanding or a slightly different perception of what African development ought to be. So some of the keywords that stood out when across the 100 plus people we spoke to is that development is something that manifests as improvement, as growth, as progress, and that the dimensions are usually economic, social, infrastructural, or societal, and that it is a process that is systemic and systematic, and so it can be measured. There was a gender dimension to the understanding of development. While women saw it more in the intangible things around progress, around advancement, around quality of life, men saw it as more tangible things of standard of living, infrastructure, and measurable growth. And then definitions into four main contexts. The first is the context of human behavior, and then there's a context of measurable indicators of progress. There is a context of human development, standard of living, and finally the context of infrastructure. Remember that it's everyday people who came up with these understanding or perceptions of what development means to an African. Definitions of development being a process of structural transformation, development being short to medium term outcome of desirable assets akin to the SDGs and things like that, and then development as the dominant discourse of modernity. We asked our respondents to what extent they are this statement. Development as in what direction to suit the will of the West? Is it developing in a comparative sense that puts us in a perpetual race to catch up with the West? Or is it developing in its own way, in its own understanding of reality and its own way of improving its own environment? When asked about development as short to medium-term outcomes of desirable targets, over 50% agreed with this, with an economist from Uganda, Astrid, saying that we don't even have a coherent understanding of what development is. And that doesn't even mean across geographies, it even means across sectors. Development is very different for someone who is an anthropologist or a sociologist, or someone who is working in the medical sector. And so if we don't have a common understanding of the word development, creating a universal yardstick becomes difficult. The question then is, why are we then judged based on universal yardsticks? The third is about development in Africa being focused on modernization and postmodernist aspiration. Close to 60% agreed with this, with Ola, an architect of Nigerian descent based in the UK, saying, we can build like Dubai. Yes, we can. We definitely can. But the question is, what does it do for our people? Franz Fanon said development in Africa refers to policies pursued by governments and international agencies, which the ruling elite and technocrats, which enrich the ruling elite and technocrats, while the masses are told to await the benefits of trickle down. And, you know, the majority strongly agree with this. In fact, over 70% of our respondents agreed with that take, with Ibrahim stating that in a place like China, when you get to the construction site, it is being championed by the local economy, employing local people, developing local infrastructure that matches with the needs and desires of the local people. And this is what development is. So how are we practicing our own development? And finally, Walter Rodney said development is not purely an economic affair, but the overall social processes which are dependent on the outcomes of man's effort to deal with the natural environment. And Ayodele, an economist based in Nigeria, said, development is economic growth plus advancement in human well-being. And that is why I would always allude.
Well, Professor Lavansi, we can't hear you anymore. Maybe we will have to let you settle in the office before you continue. May I request that Dr. Eleshin takes over from there, and Professor Lavansi will join us later. Dr.
Okay.
Eleshin.
All right, Prof, thank you very much. Okay, so I think Professor Lavansi is trying to settle in our office. I also think she was trying to round off already with her presentation. The next item on the program is the citation of the keynote speaker. Maybe I should just go ahead and continue with that. So if Professor Lavansi still have one or two things to say, she might just come up and say that later. All right, so our keynote speaker today is Professor Tade Akin-Aina. So I read the citation. Professor Tade Akin-Aina is currently head of research at the MasterCard Foundation, which is one of the largest private foundations in the world, seeking to build a world in which all people can learn and prosper. Prior to joining the foundation, Professor Tade served for 6 years as the executive director of the Partnership for African Social and Governance Research, Kenya, which is an independent, non-partisan, Pan-African, not-for-profit organization in Kenya. Before that, he was program director of higher education and libraries in Africa for the Carnegie Corporation of New York, USA, from 2008 to 2014. Over the course of his career, Professor Aina has consulted for numerous multilateral agencies, including UNDP, UNICEF, UN Habitat, the United Nations University, and the World Bank on issues ranging from urbanization and urban poverty to governance to social, educational, public health, and environmental issues such as higher education reform, nutrition, and child development, environmental and development. Professor Aina is a founding member and member of board of trustees of the Nigerian Environmental Study Team, NEST, and founder of the Lagos Group for the Study of Human Settlements. He has been a member of boards such as Trust Africa, Dakar, Senegal, the African Population Health Center, APHRC, the Council for the United States International University, Africa, the Kenya Human Rights Commission, the Seeding Labs, USA, Winrock International, USA, the Council of Management of the Africa Books Collective, UK, the Habitat International Coalition, and the governing board of the Canadian University overseas. Professor Aina was appointed full professor, Department of Sociology at the University of Lagos, Nigeria, and later served as Deputy Executive Secretary publications at the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESTRIA. He worked with the Ford Foundation in the Nairobi office from 1998 to 2008, where he was the regional representative from 2003 to 2008, an acting representative for a short period between 2001 and 2002 in Cairo office. Professor Aina has authored and co-edited 12 books, monographs, 36 chapters in books, 25 articles in journals and learned publications, and several conference papers and addresses. He was editor of African Development between 1993 and 1998. He has also been a member of the editorial advisory board of Environmental and Urbanization, the journal of the International Institute for Environment and Development, London, and the African Review of Books. Professor Aina has been an informal visiting fellow to the London School of Economics, Center for Civil Society, 2006, a guest researcher at the Nordic African Institute, Sweden, 1990, a research fellow at the Human Settlements Program of the International Institute for Environment and Development, London, 1986 to 1987. He was appointed a visiting scholar, African Leadership Center of King's College, London in 2020. His publications include The Challenge of Sustainable Development in Nigeria, co-edited with Ademola Salah of Ibadan, Child Development and Nutrition in Nigeria, co-edited with MF Zetlin and F.E. Etta, Lagos, UNICEF, 1992. The Experience of Migration in Africa, co-edited with Jonathan Baker, the Nordic African Institute, 1995, and so many other publications. Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome Professor Tade Akin-Aina, who is our keynote speaker for today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eleshi. Good morning, good afternoon from Kigali, Rwanda colleagues. First, before I go into the keynote address, I want to ally with Professor Abiodun in sending my condolences to the entire cluster community for the loss of a colleague, a younger colleague who is one of the generation, our co-leaders as we enter the different phases going forward. Please pass on my condolences to the family, to the supervisor, and to colleagues. I want to start by stating the topic of my conversation. I'm going to call it conversation with you today. And the topic is what happened to development and exploration of the life and times of concepts, theories, and practices in African development. I also want to start by borrowing from the feminist movement, which in terms of the situation, in terms of needing to situate myself intellectually, politically, and personally. And that is to say that for me, development is personal, is intellectual, and political. Thus, like many contemporary Africans today, development for me is embodied in both personal and collective narratives, expressed through political, personal, and economic journeys that have guided and determined our livelihoods, our life chances, our well-being, and in significant ways, our political and cultural trajectories. Personally, I am a child of development, born and reared in the heady days of the promises and hopes of development, nurtured on the possibilities and real opportunities of the transformation of our nation and our continent, and with a full sense and realization of our agency and being as both actors and subjects of development and transformation. So development is not an abstract, distant phenomenon for me. Development is part of my daily lived experience. It is both a matter of life and death for me and for millions of Africans ordinary Africans all over our continent. But after several decades of the experience of development, I would also like to share with you not only the experience of our small victories and moments of crisis, but also the knowledge that our contests have filled us with what I call development debris, rather than the successful networks, infrastructures, institutions, and monuments of better lives and better living that the initial promises of development carried. Thus, I cannot but ask, what happened to development? And in the rest of this address, I hope to explore the concepts, the theories, and practices in what we call African development. I have seen development in terms of arrays of concepts, not often with common ownership, theories that contest and contradict each other, range of practices that exploited rather than serve, programs and interventions that degrade rather than transform, structures that exclude rather than include, and institutions that are unjust, unequal, rather than provide justice and increase equality and equity. Of course, it has not been all doom and gloom. And in the over 7 decades of development since the Second World War, we have also seen improvements in production, in health, in nutrition, in technologies, in education and the sciences, in our physical and social infrastructures, and in many other spheres of our lives. But it's been a case of some steps forward and many steps backward. There was a time when there was the eradication of yaws. And today, some of those diseases that were eradicated that we claimed as part of our small victories of development are coming back. But the point here is that when we measure all the achievements claimed by development against our collective capability as humans and the assets, wealth, and the immense repository of our contemporary and historical knowledges, cultures, and civilizations, I am sure that the results have not been as encouraging as we have wished. This is more so at moments like today, when we face global challenges around health and pandemics, such as the coronavirus, the COVID-19, wars and civil unrests, economic instability and recessions, and incessant climate crises and ecological emergencies. Indeed, the urgent need to reimagine development today cannot be denied. The questions for us then are, how do we understand and practice development? Is our understanding aligned with our 7 decades of experience and lived realities? What have we learned? How do we bridge evidence to policy and other actions? And at what levels of specificities? These are some of the issues I hope to address with you, either directly or indirectly, in this keynote address. My objective is to raise questions, confront issues, and contribute to our process of co-creation of answers on how we engage the wicked problems that are embodied in our development processes. I will also spend some time, because I think history matters, on the history and evolution of development, in particularly situating it in the institutions that promoted and advanced it in the many forms that we know it today. Global bodies, academic sites, development institutions, bilateral aid, philanthropies, and very many more sources of the current production and reproduction of our knowledge of development. Let's begin first with the challenges of definitions. It is necessary to situate the efforts at defining or envisioning the notion, the process and practice of development in the context in which they emerged, and the various elements and signifiers of these notions in terms of the values they embody, the epistemologies and realities in which they are located in, and in certain cases, the trajectories and teleology they imply. Professor Lawrence in her initial presentation captured some of these terms. I don't want to have them seen as being reduced to big grammar, but we cannot engage development. We cannot engage all of these things we're talking about without understanding ways of knowing, ways of doing, ways of thinking, ways of being and becoming. And these are the issues of cosmologies, ontologies, epistemologies, methodologies, and actions. So those are the big grammar. And of course, the teleology is whether, as Professor Lawrence said, whether the vision of development is the recreation for us of what Dubai is or what London is. I'll come back to that. But before we go any further, I have a couple of caveats I want to introduce about development. I want to begin by saying development is neither a neutral nor innocent notion or process. It is neither neutral nor innocent. It is situated in a body of worldviews and paradigms that carry specific values, methodologies, ways of seeing, and networks of active and passive vested interests. And I had spent several years of publishing and with others around this recognition. I want our current generation to be clearly aware of that, of scholars, practitioners, and policy actors. It is not something that dropped from heaven. It is the result of a particular set of material conditions and creation. The second point is that development is not our notion in the Global South alone, but also that of our relationship with the Global North. And what that means in terms of the international division of labor, the dynamics and structure of the global political economy, and the expressions of inequalities in terms of race, gender, power relations, and access to and use of resources and wealth. Finally, it is important in part of my initial caveats that before I get to the final point, there's also another important point because I'm speaking to people located in centers of intellectual and academic production and reproduction. And that is the fact that we must remember that development as notion and practices have been carried and advanced by a variety of institutions in the global arena, ranging from the UN system, private foundations, the international financial institutions, the bilaterals, the institutes of development studies, the schools of businesses, and even private companies. It is therefore also not necessarily altruistic. The basis for the engagement of all these institutions range from the instrumental through the transactional to the humanitarian. That's my third point before we go into it. And finally, it is important to also quote a point I made in previous work published in 1993, can you believe it? And I quote, "A critical factor in the design and introduction of development theory and practice is the absence of indigenous and endogenous popular definitions of priorities, objectives, paths, and problems. And I might add popular participation and inclusion as subject and agents of development." So what constitutes dominant development theories and practice in Africa, apart from a short window in the immediate post-colonial era, have been alien, lopsided, top-down, and pretty much lacked the centering of African peoples and interests in both definitions, design, formulation, and implementation. I want to refer to that short window because it's important if Because in development, decolonization and colonization are phenomena that are intertwined. And in the struggles for political decolonization, there were elements of the writings that included economic and other and cultural decolonization. In the era that, and the Professor Lavanson referred to Frantz Fanon, in that era, the era of the Kwame Nkrumahs, of the Julius Nyereres, of the Obafemi Awolowos, of Kenneth Kaundas, of Amilcar Cabral, of thinkers across this continent, there was a short window of the space of envisioning development and of situating development, not only in terms of the gargantuan and gigantic monuments, but in terms of a set of elements that was integral to what I would call the African social project at that time, the African social project of emancipation that included Pan-Africanism, that also included at that particular moment, the envisioning. Emancipation included development. I know Amartya Sen later on wrote development as freedom. Awolowo wrote Path to Nigerian Freedom. It was not just a political treatise, it was an economic treatise. Zik wrote Renascent Africa, Nnamdi Azikiwe. Kwame Nkrumah wrote several texts. Jomo Kenyatta wrote Facing Mount Kenya. There were several texts at that particular moment that envisioned and tried to actually implement a particular vision and orientation of development. My critique of that period was that these leaders were modernizers. So they bought the modernity argument, but they were ready to transform, just like people did in Singapore, people did in Malaysia. They were ready to transform their societies and economies, and were truncated either by a series of military coups or the great reaction of the structural adjustment programs. We'll come to that. That's a key element of the history of development on this continent. And it's fascinating for me as a Nigerian to remember that there was a time that there were debates between Pius Okigbo and people like Pius Okigbo, Mabugunje, Onitiri, the different schools of thought, Balausman, and different schools of thought, Aboyade, and even foreign writers like G.K. Helena and Arthur Lewis, is reaction and division within Kwame Nkrumah. So Africa had agency. Africa had a moment in which there was a vision of development, even though, as I said, they were modernizers. And that's another question in its own. But there have been pursuit of development through that approach to modernity, but appropriated because it was not a close-ended modernity. It was our own modernities. It was a plurality of modernities, as you'll have seen in Singapore, vis-a-vis Western modernity. But we'll come back to that. So having raised the issues above, my position is that given the point at which African societies and nations encountered colonization and the devastating impact it had on our economies, societies, cultures, and polities, both in terms of the nature and severity of its exploitation and the degradation of our humanity, our environments, we cannot but define development in aspirational and normative terms, considering the better lives we aspire to and the agency and opportunity we yearn to reclaim. And I'm saying this because a key element of the critique of development as notion and practice is that some people talk about development as basically concepts that demonstrate tension between the aspirational and the normative, and the ideal-typical constructs, and those that address actually existing structures and practices. Thus, our visions and expectations and hope for development versus what we conceive to be what development looks like in practice often come to play in our conceptions and interventions. But in Africa, we really, really must be clear about that. You cannot remove the aspirational, given the very colonial encounter. Encountering development was a colonial encounter. If you go back again to the history of development in Nigeria, and you remember the Anglo-Saxon element of the Colonial Development Welfare Act of 1945 that was meant to address the situation and the uprising of the labor movements in the colonies of India, the Caribbean, and Africa. Then let us begin from that very, very recognition. And it is not a simple unilinear extraction of experiences and understanding. It is just the intricate articulation of the colonial encounter with our current post-colonial beings. And we remain the totality of that experience. We don't have to be apologetic for it. We have to recognize it. And that's why I talked about that window. That window, if anybody tries to observe, between 1957, in fact, it goes back to 1945. If you look at some of the writings of Macaulay, you look at some of the historical writings, you look at the thinking of Mahatma Gandhi across the world. That window, and don't forget Mahatma Gandhi started his struggles on this continent in Africa. He started in the colonized territory of South Africa. So that particular window, right up to about 1960, 63, 65, were specific windows of imagination and the imagining of development. More in the sense of the amalgam of personalities and peoples that we are, both as colonial and post-colonial subjects and as modernizers. So I believe that we have to reclaim that development in concrete terms, therefore for us as African, is aspirational and normative, but also a living and lived reality, because it is work in progress. In this case, it is a notion in constant motion and a process with imagination, expectation, aspirations, but always an open-ended and continuing destination. And I say this so that we can avoid the teleological trap of a distinct Western prototype or endpoint. So for me, the future of urban Lagos is neither London nor Dubai, but rather an open-ended construct based on the interplay, tension, conflict, and working out of imagination, intentionality, interests, and agency. Urban Lagos is a work in progress, open to co-creation by its people and residents in the reconciliation of clash, of ideas, of interests, of agencies. So Dubai is not Dubai or any of the Western prototypes or postmodern variants do not necessarily constitute an endpoint in our imagination and reimagination of development. So I don't want to disappoint Professor Lawansi. She has put some pressure on me many times to offer a definition. I was going to be slave-free and not do that, but I'll just go back to something I've done many, many years ago, just to give us some comfort. But no definition is, because development itself is constantly in motion, is a dynamic notion, is a notion of co-creation, is a notion of endless possibilities, is a notion of work in progress. Any definition will be static and will have lost its relevance by the time it is put out there. But let me put this out there. So I'll say development is a qualitative and quantitative, positive and beneficial transformation of the lives and livelihoods of peoples, not only in terms of production, but also in relation to the various institutions that ensure their dignity as human beings and guarantees that their material and non-material needs are taken care of. I'll leave it as that. And you will see that there are many holes you can pick in that in terms of the various conceptual. It's like driving through an autobahn, seven lanes here, 25 lanes there. But I've taken the liberty to do that because I thought I had to respond to the demand of Professor Lawansi to offer a definition. Otherwise, I will have actually made this keynote without really offering a definition. But I must also add beyond that definition, again, that meaningful and sustainable development is also a process that enhances the stewardship of nature and the environment, rather than the pursuit of its destruction for either the profit motive or the sole benefit of human beings in what I call our pluriverse. That is from the work of Arturo Escobar, the new deep ecologist movement, talking about the pluriverse, not the universe. The universe is a Western male dominant conception that actually homogenizes and monolithizes our very, very existence. And therefore places, and if you go back to the great religions, places man at the center of the so-called universe, when there's really a pluriverse of cultures, of ecologies, of worlds, of productions, and of cosmologies, and many other things. Anyway, again, that's another thing in terms of the dynamic nature of the understanding. So what emerges from the points above is the need for us to clarify our assumptions, our contexts, our locations in history as we envision, conceptualize, and in many cases, design or contribute to the design and implementation of elements of the development process and development practices. We need to have an awareness and intentionality around whose interests have been served, who owns the process, whose values and vision of the world does it carry, who ultimately benefits, and in what measure and weight. And of course, just like the questions that Professor Lawansi asked, is there one monolithic approach and pathways to achieving the promises of human well-being and transformation that development once implied? Or are there multiple pathways, approaches, and alternative routes to the same goals? Or really, are the promises real? The promises of development as embedded in Western modernity? Do those promises really carry a promise of equity, a promise of social, ecological, environmental, gender, and other justices? Do they carry the promises of productivity across the world? Those are some of the questions. So our over 7 decades of contemporary development experience in Africa showed us we have in theory raised some of these questions, but we have failed in practice to address them intentionally and at scale. Yes, Samira Amin. Yes, Claude Ake. Yes, Ukudiba Unali. Yes, Bade Unimode. Yes, Isa Shivji, and many more have raised these questions. But then, this is the challenge to our new generation. We were at one time a generation of free-floating intellectuals and academics and scholars who did not seize or engage the political process, did not seize or engage the activist process, did not seize or engage. We thought we actually again got trapped in the Western modernity, in the Western modern conception of the role of the scholar or the role of the academic that is not engaged with actually the concrete transformation of the societies. And therefore, we write all these volumes of books that I'm taking the opportunity to remind by us by dropping some of the names of, Wamba Diawamba, Mahmoud Mandani, the whole range of people who have thought about it and moved from even the overall global notion. I mean global in the sense of a concept, not in the sense of a universal presence. That then comes to the role of the states and markets, peasant agriculture, industrialization, import substitution industrialization, urban development, and all of those things that have emerged as sub-constructs and sub-concepts of the transformation that we actually locate in development. But then the question is, what then is to be done? Let us but I would like for us to examine development practices and processes to see whether we can find answers to some of these questions. But again, I also want to invite challenge us in terms of the immensity, particularly as Africans, of the task that we face. And therefore, I'm going to try to locate what has happened to development in the context of the significant global institutions that have been carriers and advocates of development as you know it. Again, it still remains, whether we like it or not, a nebulous and highly contested notions that entered the international public political parlance from around the end of the Second World War. And from then on, it changed the language of transitions of nations and the thinking and practice of international aid and philanthropy, along with a variety of prefixes such as social, economic, human, community, and sustainable. It has become one of the most widely used notions to describe in the main the transitions or hope about transitions of non-Western peoples to versions of Western modernity that assume some degrees of economic growth and productivity, and the presence of social, political, and economic institutions predominantly modeled on the forms and values of Western market capitalism. More than human rights or the democratization project, the development project as a form of transformation has been one of the greatest carriers of Western economic values and dreams of prosperity for nations around the world. With the collapse of the Eastern Bloc and the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, the alternative, and we can see the consequences of the disintegration in the current re-emergence of the, it's not even Cold War, actual war in Europe today. It has been replaced, the alternative narratives of communist and socialist development expired and have been replaced with variants of capitalist development, particularly market capitalism. The latter realization of the weakness of capitalism to address inequality, economic exploitation, or to effectively provide for the weak and marginalized led to the numerous inclusion of the prefixes we talked about. More recent recognition of the threats of unbridled capitalism to the arts environment and ecosystem and the sustainability has contributed to the addition of the popular prefix of sustainable development. Theoretically, development has undergone several critiques of its various forms and practices, their ideological and political underpinnings, and their consequences for African societies, economies, and polities. I won't go into none of the critiques, there are several of them. However, what is important in the understanding of the evolution of the development discourse is the powerful transformation project and imagery carried within this notion, and how it affected the deployment of both material, human, and intellectual resources in a new era of international assistance and aid that began with the end of the Second World War and the creation of the new United Nations Organization and its many agencies. June 26, 1945, the establishment of the UN Charter. You all need to keep that in mind. And the biggest carriers of the notions of development at the UN organization. Both the United Nations and what can be called the development phenomenon appeared on the world scene together, and development, along with peace and human rights, provided the United Nations an initial raison d'etre. The idea of development was enshrined in the United Nations Charter in 1948, and the organization commissioned some significant global reports on the world economy that were tremendously forward-looking for their time and attempted to address the key problems of labor relations, world trade, productivity, and the nature of economic underdevelopment. For those of us from West Africa, I'd like to remind you, I talked about W. Arthur Lewis, first Black Nobel Prize winner in economics, first Black Vice Chancellor of the University of Manchester, economic advisor to Kwame Nkrumah, industrialization with unlimited supply of labor. That was then one of the principles. It became a point of even discussion in Nigeria. If you remember Aboyade's Foundations of an African Economy, that was another book that tried to look at this issue around that time. So Arthur Lewis later on won the Nobel Prize, but also was significant in some of the ways ideas and policies emerged. And when we talk about all of this, these massive studies, these were some of the studies. And of course, there was a work of G.K. Helena, Peasant Agriculture and Economic Growth again in Africa. The United Nations was also central in promoting and disseminating some significant ideas that attempted to address the issues of national and international equitable development. I don't know how many people remember the basic needs approach and the whole debate around redistribution with growth. Again, these were concepts that demanded us. The UN also helped to promulgate and promote in 1961, what was known as the first development decade. And many of its key agencies carried forward the ethics. UNDP emerged around that time. The ethics, the ideals, the goals and practices of the different documents, outcomes of major global conferences, and ideas that were enshrined in the development decades. The driving force of the UN behind the development process and phenomenon provided the frame for the interventions of government, the academy. Let's us never absolve ourselves. Never absolve ourselves. The academy was central. Even in Nigeria alone, if you look at what happened at the Nigerian Institute for Social and Economic Research, the works of H.M. Onitiri, the works around urban development that was located in NISA. NISA was one of the big places where you had the work around urban development and urban planning first emerged before it shifted into the University of Ibadan, places like that. And I'm saying this because I'm talking to my colleagues who are in that particular area. Even then at that time, it was a robust moment of engagement and thinking. Another thing that I keep saying is that if you go back to the experiences of countries around that time, of Singapore, of Malaysia, even Vietnam that went through a war, of China and India, of South Korea, Taiwan, and you compare them with what happened to us on the continent in Africa. One thing is that for whatever it is worth, whether it is redistribution with growth, whether it's import substitution, industrialization, whether it's the transformation of peasant agriculture, whether it is the engagement with commodities, Africa never had the opportunity to do anything long enough. It was Africa that after every 10 years will have to subject itself to a new way of doing things. At that time, Singapore held on to what he was doing for quite some time. India, even when you think about it, held on to what he was doing. China loved itself against these agencies and held on to what he was doing. The Tigers held on to what they were doing. It was Africa today is industrialization with unlimited supply of labor. Tomorrow, it's basic needs. The day after is redistribution with growth. The day after is informal sector. The day after is this. Just think about that in terms of the evolution of this concept. and look at the whole notion of the governance of development, because we cannot talk about development without talking about the governance of development. We cannot talk about the development without talking about the guardrails of politics and institutional development that encourage and led to development. So it's not a question about reducing it to corruption or reducing it to other things. It's a question about what was it in the context of the African continent that made it difficult for African nations, either as individual nations or as part of corporate entities, to actually have a vision which they held until, which they worked around. Look at the big debate in the 1970s between the Ivorian experiment and the Kenyan experiment, both of them based on actually a capitalist approach to agriculture, beginning with the plantations and almost the bourgeois structure of Hufo-Buwai, and the coffee and tea plantations of Kenya. Those were experiments that once occurred on this continent. So it's not, when we begin to assess what has happened with Africa, what happened to development. I'm just throwing this there. I'm not giving you answers. I'm just throwing this there. I'm saying, because the question is what happened to development? So, so the driving force of the UN behind the development process and the phenomenon provided the frame for the intervention of government, the academy, indigencies, and philanthropies in Africa in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, culminating in the Millennium Development Goals of the early 21st century and the Sustainable Development Goals that superseded the MDGs. But one thing to remember was the late 1970s, the 1980s, and last parts of the 1990s was significantly troubled periods for Africa in terms of its many economic and political crises. This crisis created deliberate change of momentum in ideas, in practices, and interventions across the economies, the polities and policies, and of course, the governance of development. And it's centered around engaging the debt crisis, around the issues of liberalization and deregulation. So as a Durham guy, one of the key thinkers and heads of UNRIS many years ago stated, the 1980s were marked as they were by the onset of the debt crisis and the Thatcher and Reagan policies that emphasized deregulation, privatization, the markets, and the private sector, and they constituted a severe setback to the UN agenda for development, evolved in the 1960s and 1970s. In the realms of ideas and policy, the center stage was occupied by stabilization and structural adjustment programs initiated by the Bretton Woods institution. And I happened to have joined CODESRIA in the 90s, in which every single concern of a key element of the African and social science and humanities communities were devoted to the crisis. The crisis became development for Africa. The structural adjustment, the whole array of production around that time by people like Bayo Lukoshi, Bjorn Beckman, Joran Haydn, the literature of the 1980s and 1990s were adjustment and crisis, stabilization. Those of you who are aware of that, you will see again what happened to us. We could not even think. We were drowned in engaging crisis rather than having a transformative vision and a transformative project beyond crisis. So I've paid some attention to some of the key highlights of UN ideas and interventions here, because I thought they constitute an important frame to the context of development thinking and practice, and the whole terrain of development aid, study, and practice. In fact, many of us might not be aware of the UN Resolution 41/128, advocating the right to development, that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1986. So when you think about this development notion, some people, the UN as a key player. But then the UN was neutered and lost its struggle with the IFIs. And again, with the emergence of the neoliberal market-led economic policies, the creation of deep in the hearts of the central banks of African countries, deep in the hearts in the treasuries, deep in the hearts of our urban planning, deep in the hearts of our business schools, a market orientation ideology that did not see any other aspect of ideological orientation, that did not recognize indigenous knowledges and indigenous creation, that really, it was a coup. It was a modernist coup because it re-entrenched neoliberal modernity. And so you see that all of the reproductive agencies. So today, even when we talk about development, I'm not sure how strong the institutes of development on the continent are. I think the business schools are actually stronger in terms of defining trajectories, in terms of thinking, in terms of how do you use financial instruments? How do we work with innovations? When we talk about innovations, how do we work with innovations? I ask myself occasionally, innovation for. So this is the setting. And I believe that we need to begin to rethink this. The reimagination in an era, and a good example of what happened with this history of development was the near paralysis of our initial responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, beyond mandatory lockdowns and prohibitive state enactments. We had lost the stamina, the energy, the capacity to be responsive, to be adaptive, to be agile, because we were trapped in a kind of separation between state, markets, societies, economies, and communities. The sinew, the backbone of our entire systems have been dislocated by this sectoralization and this orientation. But let me now move very quickly. I think the challenge
Prof, we have 5 more minutes, so we will urge you to, we know you have a lot to say, but we will urge you to 5 minutes round off, and so we can also hear other contributors.
My apologies, Prof. This is a matter after my heart, so forgive me. I will just quickly put this a quick closure.
Okay, thank you very much.
Of a post-COVID-19 era, the countries of Africa now operate in a world driven by a set of forces and dynamics that are making new demands on the notions and practice of development. As we pointed out, beyond reimagining, African nations will require clarity of vision and goals, disciplined intentionality, unyielding political will, completely new orientation of working within Africa for trade, capital, labor, and other resources, and determined knowledge-driven and engaged political leadership. I will not list these considerations, but again, you will see some of them in terms of what we do need to do. The emerging role of the AFCFTA, the African Trade Agreement, the emerging role of what we need to do with the coming of the 4th Industrial Revolution, the rise of new technologies, digital integration, the reconceptualization and reconfiguration of our food and agricultural systems, our social policies, our technologies and inclusive finance, and our strong health systems. And then, of course, how we deal with global transnational systems and networks. So the question for me is that, will African nations in the post-COVID-19 development era reconfigure their global economic, cultural, technological, and scientific cooperation and diplomatic relations in ways that advance their autonomous, individual, and collective economic and development agenda? The discussions and questions above will depend on how far Africans reimagine their notions and practice of development and the world in which we find ourselves. Please, my sincere apologies if I had spent some time. I think this is something that we should all be thinking of: the books, the materials, the multimedia that we'll produce going forward. Thank you very much.
Prof, thank you very, very much, sir. We discovered that you had a lot to say in a very short time. We really appreciate you. We try to make this available online to everyone so that the discussions can continue. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. Quickly, we'll have two discussants, Dr. Akin-Aina and Dr. Cassandra McTason. Then after their responses, then we'll have questions from the house. Prof, I think you please help us to still stay around. In the next 20, 30 minutes, other people will be able to ask their questions, because I know that your lecture has provoked a lot of reactions from people, including me, Prof. So please quickly, Dr. Akin-Aina, in the next 12, 15 minutes, can we please have your response? That's the first response. And after you, we have Dr. Cassandra McTason. Dr. Akin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I must say that it's quite really a pleasure listening to Professor Akiyano. I've not met him, but I think our first contact was on Facebook. I think some years back, and I must say that you're one of these inspirations of that generation for many of us. We grew up in our careers reading some of your works. So thanks a lot for that really inspiring lecture. I am going to. It's a bit difficult coming after someone like Professor Akiyano. But I'm going to try to be a discussant that struggles, that finds something to complain about in the lecture, about the lecture, and to ask you to try to push you to clarify or to think a bit more about some of the points that you have made. I'm going to start by saying that one of the things that struck me the most was when you said that in the ways in which you have framed development, that your conception of development is, of course, is rightly complex and quite nuanced. And yet, one of the things I liked about it was also how it also accounts for the kind of broader global universe within which we think and practice development. I thought that was really important. I also thought that it was really important, very useful, the ways in which you kind of frame development as aspiration. And I think that even though the concept of aspiration itself in kind of broader anthropological terms is in and of itself pretty slippery, so which is kind of a tough thing to use a rather slippery concept itself to try to explain a concept that is also pretty slippery in and of itself. So, but I think that doing that is actually a useful. Yeah, doing that is actually a useful way of accounting for the very nebulous nature of development and all of this the kind of long evolution of the concept that you have talked about. But I also see that you also maybe in part because of your own career trajectory and all that your own career trajectory, you also kind of insisted that development, even though it is ultimately it's about aspiration and transformation in ways in which are potentially or in and of themselves abstract, but you are then saying that development is not abstract and that development is something that is a lived experience that is tangible in ways that can be really profound for people's everyday lives. Now, you also said that development is neither neutral nor innocent, which I think is a really important point to make, because it's very easy for us when we kind of get into all of these kind of technocratic ways of thinking about human progress, about modernization. It's very easy to forget that none of these concepts are neutral or innocent, and that these concepts themselves are kind of steeped are a result of very, as you put it, very specific material conditions. And anyone who has read the 1990s, 1980s and 90s literature on structural adjustment that you talked about, that you also contributed to in very significant ways, that's one thing that you will quickly learn in political science in Nigeria or in Africa, that this is all, there's nothing that's neutral or innocent about all of these concepts, neither democracy or development or any of these things. But I think that one thing that that you didn't mention, you alluded to, but you didn't quite mention, was that it's not just that this development is just not a product of specific material conditions, but that development is also a very, very specific ideological, is also a product of very specific ideological, normative and cultural hegemonies themselves. And I think we cannot. I do not think that we can fully capture the politics of development if we were only to focus on the material conditions that produce these kinds of development, and forget that these material conditions do not inevitably produce development, as we say. This material condition, the reason why development is practiced and thought about and defined and legitimized in these particular ways, is precisely because there are specific ideological normative ideas that are normative hegemonies that insist that this is how the material conditions have to be translated into development thinking. And of course, you kind of also talked about this absence of indigenous priorities, and you used the word absence, and I was wondering if absence was actually the way to think about this, about the problem that we all know exists with how to connect indigenous priorities to these kind of globalized forms of development that we see, and that because is it that these priorities are really absent? Because I do not think they are. I think that what is there is simply because these particular indigenous priorities have been delegitimized by the hegemony and the dominance of particular frames, which kind of leads back to my initial point about it's not just about material conditions, it's also about specific ideological kind of normative hegemonies that are driving how we think about development. And I think that this kind of leads me to this very seductive, pretty seductive point that's often made when people talk about development. And you find this a lot in the development sector, about the idea of co-creation, about the idea of inclusive development and all of that. And I agree that co-creation is, of course, a pretty it is a seductive concept. How can anyone argue against co-creation? But I think that it's not really clear what that co-creation actually means in practice. So, for instance, how will co-creation resolve the problems of power imbalances, in this creative process itself? So, if we keep talking about co-creation of, say, the urban Lagos, for instance, co-creation of Lagos by every stakeholder, all the people, all actors, including the people in the slums of Lagos and the people in the more affluent parts of Lagos, including the ideas of investors, of capital itself, but also the kind of normative ideas that shape what the city means, how we should think about the city. Now, if we make these seductive arguments about co-creation without necessarily accounting for the fundamental power imbalances that render co-creation something that people like Hickey and Dutoit were called something like adverse incorporation, for instance, that the idea that people participate in the creation of development or participate in the creation of the city does not mean that people actually have people are able to co-create in the real sense of the word. And I think that using concepts like co-creation in this really seductive sense papers over these real forms of inequalities, power imbalances that ultimately shape the very, very broader development landscape. And then I'll then go back to what I thought what I liked about your idea that we should think about development as aspiration. I'd say that I mean people like Vincent Tucker, for instance, have written about development as optimism. To understand development, we really need to uh, get a grip of this kind of idea, this idea of optimism itself. That to develop is to be optimistic about the process, is to be optimistic about the structure, and to be optimistic ultimately about to be able to anticipate goodness, as it were, of the future. But optimism, I think, it's also one of those um, uh, development and aspiration as optimism as is also one of those potentially really misleading and seductive concepts. In part because that optimism is often not deployed to question the very structure the very material structure that will determine or that determines that frames development in itself. And I think that one of the one interesting take on this optimism would be from Laurent Berland, who was who described it as cruel optimism, where somehow the goodness that arrives at the end of this neoliberal process of development, of democracy, perhaps even of this general everyday idea of progress for the individual, that because the vast majority, because the system itself is designed, that the process of extraction and of accumulation in and of itself requires that resources, power be extracted from the non-dominant sectors of the economy, of the population, and all of that. It means that optimism itself is fundamentally something that the vast majority of people cannot grasp. And so I wonder how thinking about development as aspiration, thinking about development as optimism, as something to anticipate, because, well, it is some, or even thinking about development as possible itself, is how is it fundamentally different from trickle down economics? I wonder, and I think that that's something I would want. I would really like to hear your thoughts about. And then it also, of course, leads us to this idea that if that ultimately in many ways that development is also about it's also about wealth creation. It's about social it's also about wealth creation and leveling up social inequalities. But then the tension between the creation of wealth itself and the goal of fighting inequality, how does development as aspiration necessarily help us to resolve this? And how in your own view do you think that that we can balance this tension between the creation of wealth and the inequalities that inevitably follow it within this kind of neoliberal system? And some of the other things you touch on, it's a question of whose development then are we really talking about? How do we, for instance, account? Professor Lawansin was saying in a talk, in the opening talk, she was talking about intangibles. She was talking about intangibles and these kind of very gendered ways of thinking around development and the intangibles. And so, if there's a lot that mean progress to going back to Professor Akin-Aina's talk about the indigenous voices, if there's a lot in how indigenous voices kind of define progress, it's a lot that is intangible about it. Is it even appropriate for us to try to measure development? And maybe what we should simply be doing instead of attempting to measure development is simply to imagine development and not attempt to measure it at all. And of course, I think that in this, it's then important for us to kind of think about the what type of disparity systems, for instance, we're framing this process of measuring development. How are these disparity systems that are framing how we measure development? How are they themselves implicated in the normative contestations around good or bad, around development and non-development, around all of this that we need to. So ultimately, I think we need to pay closer attention, again, which is to the internal political universe within which development occurs. So, for instance, how how would social fractures within our societies impact on the ways in which we conceptualize development, but also the ways in which we use development, the way we do development, and all of these kind of internal political and social fractures within our society around ethnicity, around religion, all of these things, they can constrain or facilitate both what we define as development or development as, but also how we do development. I think that ultimately, I do not. The good thing is that I'm an academic. I don't try to be anything else. So it's easy because my job is simply to complain about stuff and not necessarily to try to fix stuff, and hope that people like Professor Akiyano, who are more in the front lines of fixing stuff, will do the job of fixing stuff on our behalf. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and thanks a lot, Professor Akiyano, for that.
Okay, so all right, thank you very much, Dr. Iwilade. That was a very fantastic response. Quickly, let's go to Dr. Cassandra McThiessen, please.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
everyone. First of all, thank you very much for all the well wishes for the family of Richard. I'll pass those on as soon as possible. So thank you for a very, very enlightening presentation, Professor Akin-Aina. I was very happy to listen to the presentation, which had a lot of historical depth to it. I think that was one thing that was missing from the concept calls. I was a bit worried that we would be dealing with this one notion of development. So it was very good to see you move through these different moments of, colonial rule, the post-independence period, disillusionment, and wherever we may find ourselves today. I appreciated the very cautious definition of development that I found. So you talked about the contestations, as well as the imagined possibilities, potentialities, of course, of that notion, which indicates that perhaps we were dealing with very different things at different moments in time when we talked about development. In the case of this notion of co-production of development, which you indicated as being very rife in the immediate post-independence era, I thought that was very intriguing, and that made me also ask to what extent we find ourselves in a similar position today. To what extent has the COVID-19 crisis given open up a window for co-creation, or are we still kind of finding ourselves really facing the same limitations in dealing with nation states, or let's say political elites, in dealing with international organizations? Have we moved anywhere differently from where we found ourselves, let's say in the 1960s? I think another key point of the presentation was, of course, this notion of African multiplicity, so moving it beyond a belief in or a adherence to Western capitalist logics, which of course is more easily said than done. So how can we de-emphasize things like patriarchy, like ownership, exclusion, like singularity when it comes to Africa? How can we go to discovering, African multiplicities, multiple Africas, and where will that get us in trying to find a place of betterment and improvement? Of course, myself, I'm someone who, I have a background in social economic history, but now I'm kind of dealing with global knowledge production. So again, the question of how do we move beyond just thinking about wealth and economic growth to thinking about strengthening from within? So things like just a self-understanding, maybe not a singular self-understanding of Africa, but a stronger self-understanding of Africa's from the the level of from the ethnic level to the national level to the diasporic level. How can we create strength just in that arena in and of itself? Then, of course, we're dealing with we're in an academic context right now, and higher education has always seemed to have played a very central role in this journey of achieving something better for Africa. So I guess, to what extent are our higher education institutions problem solvers, or are they part of the problem? And will, let's say, a greater ownership over these institutions are greater perceived over these institutions, over the knowledge that they produce, help us to achieve something that's better as well, to get up to a different place when it comes to this development discourse. And then another question I had was, when it comes to this new reimaginations that we're talking about, is it really just something that's happening in the academy? Is it happening in the digital sphere? We talked about, you talked about the people. So what's the role of the people in this discourse, in this current moment? What roles are they playing in this kind of a reimaginations that we're talking about today? And maybe that's something for the wider audience to chime in on as well. And I appreciated the engagement with the feminist discourse. I think that also relates to this notion of, multiplicity. So where are the African women when we talk about, shaping the future reimaginations? We often, hear references to male scholars, to male politicians. What about the women? I appreciated the references to women in the survey that was shown earlier. So what do we do with that information? Do we just acknowledge it, or do we take that forward with us in the future? Okay, and I think I'll leave my comments there for now. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Cassandra. Sorry once again for the loss of your students. So quickly, we have about 20 minutes. I think we can now field questions from the General House. You can direct your questions to Professor Tade Akin-Aina, Dr. Akin-Wilade, or the response from Dr. Cassandra Matese. We've had a lot from the chat room, but I think we should start from people who might want to ask direct questions. I can see one or two hands up already. Professor Jebode from University of Ibadan. Prof, can you just unmute yourself and ask your questions, sir?
Yes, thank you very much for this very stimulating conversation. I'll be very brief, and my question goes straight to Professor Tade Akin-Aina. So one of the problems and the setbacks that you identified was the problem of consistency in development policy, planning, and practice in Africa. The one very interesting way you put it was Africa never practiced anything long enough. And you gave examples from BNA, basic needs assessment, to all forms of development, conception, and practice, and how we just really never stayed on something long enough. So if the solution is on staying on something long enough, I see another problem with that, and that is the problem of this ever-changing, the problem of the 4-year replacement of political actors. And so we have needs, for instance, National Economic Empowerment and Development Scheme or something by the Obasanjo administration, which didn't outlast him. So would you think, and we will really forever continue to have elections and replace these political actors, and with them would be the transition and the disappearance of their policies and actions and practices and plans. Would the solution be a framework that seeks to disconnect development planning and practice from politicians and political office holders, and then domicile that with the public service, the civil service? Would that be some way of ensuring consistency and continuity in a way that is not truncated by the 4-year replacement of political actors? Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Prof. So let's have Akim Akinwale. Please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Aina, for a very stimulating and very loaded, interesting conversation around development. I enjoyed it. The question I have, sir, is bordering on one, from the last speaker making reference to your comments on the fact that Africans do not stay on something for a long time. So from this premise, sir, I want to ask a question that is development not rooted in culture? Why do I ask this question? Africans have culture. If development is rooted in culture, can we still, is there, how do we relate with that statement that Africans do not stay on a particular project for long? I want to understand that maybe you are speaking from the angle of post-colonial history of development and the political policies that were formulated to possibly drive a change. So I want to understand, I want to clarify if your statement is loaded from that perspective. And how do we reconcile that perspective with maybe if development is rooted in culture, then what has happened to African culture? Does that mean the indigenous practices which are rooted in African culture are no longer relevant in the analysis of development in the modern day society? And is development not a process of change? Then this change, is it necessarily positive? Can this change be negative? And if this change is negative, can we then say that development could be negative? So these are a few questions that I have, Prof, just for the sake of the conversation which you have ignited. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. Let's have Kayode Sola. Professor Kayode Sola, can we have you, please? Can you unmute yourself? Unmute yourself, please.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Am I audible now? Am I audible now?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, I joined the existing protocol, especially in appreciating the presenters, teacher, Professor Tade Akin-Aina, and Akin-Aina, and every other person who has spoken. Now, as we all agreed, even in this place, development is nebulous, is a very problematic concept, similar to many of those that we use in the social sciences. Two questions I want to put forward. Number one, the elementary knowledge of social sciences that we have positions us to believe that whatever happens at the superstructure in any society is premised upon the substructure. And the substructure fundamentally refers to or extends to the thoughts of the people. Philosophers will call it philosophy of the people. But I choose to use the word thought so as not to be unnecessarily technical. The thought of the African people, the authentic indigenous thought of the African people. Prof, what does this say about development and how has it changed our navigation of developmental processes over the years? You know, in identifying that thought, I do not necessarily mean that which belongs to the entire Africa, but if it is Makariri thought, if it is Ubuntu thought, if it is any other thing, or it could be the Yoruba thought. How have these thoughts defined our years of navigating the process of development? That's number one. Number two, this sounds simplistic, but I think very passionately that until we answer that question, we may still be sailing in the dark. And that question is, at what point do we consider a nation or a country or an economy or a social formation, at what point do we consider that piece developed? To the extent that we can look at the country Nigeria I mean, in Africa, say Nigeria, say Ghana, say, okay, Nigeria is not developed, but Ghana is developed. What are the yardsticks? At what point do we arrive at this? It could be the other way around. Ghana is not developed, Nigeria is developed. At what point do we arrive at that development that we are sailing for, that we are solving for in this discourse? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Iswola. I'll invite Ifeanyi Oduaro and Dr. Peter Osimiri for their brief comments now.
All right. Thank you so much. Prof, I want to say a very big thank you for the wonderful presentation. I am Ifeanyi Oduaro from Imo State University. I'm so happy to be here. I must say that
Hello, mommy.
This is coming at a time like this. Hello, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Hello, mommy. Hello. Yes, ma'am.
Hello, hope I'm audible. Hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So I wanted to ask a question, but first, Prof, to a very large extent agree that development is a work in progress, and obviously this is one of the reasons why the conference that was held had to look at talking about people being referred to as less developed, because obviously they are not actually static, they are moving. But then what comes to mind is how do we move? How far are we moving? Because obviously I try to look back at the distance past, and then in line with what you said about sustaining a particular action for a long period of time, and that is what Africa and Nigeria in particular is lacking. And then I try to look at a situation whereby, is it that Africa actually jumped a particular stage of economic development, as defined by W.W. Rostow, and then, simply moving from the traditional society, probably because of the discovery of oil, we try to just jump and say, okay, we don't want to actually follow the path. And then it's about, service delivery or so. So I think it's a good thing you're calling us to mind to retrace our steps and then to look back, how far we've come, coming back to the drawing table and see what we can actually, do, in terms of, creating a path. Mabogija did talk about a spatial closure that China, what they did for a long time, bringing their people together, indigenous practice within them, and then before they now actually open up their doors, to neighbors to come in. So I want to ask, what is it that we are likely to do? Because the Ajaguta steel that actually failed is not simply because we did not practice a particular process for long, but I think it's within the mindset of the people. What is your notion? What is this kind of belief? What do we really, stand to gain, in terms of it's my area and not my area? But obviously, it should be something that should be defined in the policy, should be held in the policy. So my question goes thus: what is it? What is the way forward, for Africa and for Nigeria in particular, to move, to say indeed we're actually developed? Because obviously, if you look at what is happening, especially in the what recently concluded, what's it called, the primaries, the use of the purchasing power parity is dropping and all that. So this does not really tell of of development. It doesn't really tell of a country that is planning towards development. And of course, it's something that does not really follow the order. So what is the way forward, my Prof? That's what I want to ask. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Peter, over to you. And please, let's keep it brief so that everybody can have a chance to talk before and Prof enough time to respond. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, moderator. I hope you can hear me. I hope I'm
yes, please go ahead.
All right, yes. Thank you. I want to thank Professor Tade Akin-Aina for that very loaded and very inspiring delivery. My question has to do with, you spoke very, very glowingly about the debate around development that took place just in the post-independent period, talking about the Uris of this world, the Nkrumahs of this world. And then you said the problem you have with them is that they are modernists. My question is, what is wrong with being modernist? Because I think that you can actually indigenize modernism or something. Then do you find anything of value in those debates and discussions that could be useful for us in the present era going forward with development? That's the question. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Peter. I'll now invite Sheung Fategbe and Tengu Nomishan to make their brief comments, and then Prof will respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate the thought-provoking presentation of Prof. Thank you, sir. My question is, how will... Hello, am I audible, please? Can we hear me?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
Yes, my question is, the policy actors are actually the ones people look up to deliver development. And now we are talking about, okay, we don't need to compare ourselves with Dubai, with UK. Then my question is, how do we as intellectuals conceptualize what development is for policy actors? Because we say it's fluid, it's slippery, and some of these ways we conceptualize it as something that is ongoing. But policy actors, they need something concrete to pursue, to achieve, so that people can re-elect them. So my question is, how will the intellectuals, the scholars, make policy actors understand development and then be able to pursue it, to deliver it? Thank you very much, sir.
All right, thank you. And finally, we have Tengu.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope I can be heard over there.
We can hear you.
Okay, I appreciate Prof so much for the thought-provoking lecture. My name is Tengu Silvanus Nomshan from Federal University Lokoja. I want to dwell on culture and development in Africa. You see, culture as an expert in heritage, I understand that culture is a way of life. It encompasses everything a certain people or society do as a way of sustaining itself. I want to believe that development in Africa, particularly in Nigeria where we live, have negated culture. Development have been an accidental occurrence. It has occurred in an accidental way. I stand to be corrected anyway, because if culture is driven the development we have, I think development would have been progressively be impacting. You will need to know what people need. You will need to know what is going to be useful to people before you go ahead to work towards bringing it to be in place. But if you look at African development, it's somehow detached from the needs of the people, from the wants of the people, from what is the pressing need of the state. You can see development, like in projects, we have a lot of abandoned projects, particularly in Nigeria and other African countries. It's part of the development we're talking about. Resources are wasted. They build things, they construct things that are useless completely to people. So the question of culture come into play. Are we really pursuing development for the benefit of the people? Or are we following what people are doing elsewhere for the purpose of doing what others are doing? That is my question. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now invite, okay, we have two who want to comment. If you can make it 30 seconds each, Mr. Obasanjo Joseph and Professor Wale Alade, just 30 seconds each. Thank you. Mr. Obasanjo, over to you, and then...
Yes, thank you very much. My development communication lecturer taught us in our class that we're not going to be pontificating and disturbing ourselves with models and theories of development. We should just look at the 5 basic things of life. What is happening to water? What is happening to electricity? What is happening to food? What is happening to housing? You know, the basic things of life. And then, Prof, you've told us this morning that if we engage in this rat race of comparing ourselves with the Western world, we'll keep lamenting that we are not developing, that nothing is happening in Africa. So my question is just basically about our basic, modest understanding of the quality of life. What should be the modest one, so that we will stop competing, and we'll continue to go on the endless race that will continue to put us, at misery. What do you think is the modest one for all of us in Africa? Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. And finally, Professor Wale Alade.
Thank you very much, Professor Lawansin. I want to say thank you to Prof for that wonderful explanation on development. Mine is not really more of a question, but an opinion derived from the position of late President of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, who said that when we talk of development should be people-focused, and that we should ask 3 basic questions. What is happening to the physical well-being of the people? What is happening to the social well-being of the people? What is happening to the political well-being of the people, the economic well-being? He said these are the fundamental questions that we should ask when we want to talk about development and measuring development. And I think that this is my own perspective too, that development should be focused on the people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. So please, we humbly ask Professor Tade Akin-Aina to just round off by speaking to the comments that have been raised by different participants. Prof, please just try to help us to round off. Trying to speak to all those things.
Thank you. This is very, very useful, very provocative. And some of them are actually classifiables in terms of broad categories. One is the learning question, what is to be done? The second one, basically, is the question about how do we think development, and then and that's related to the superstructure versus infrastructure, and then the question and the whole question about optimism, development as optimism. So, and then finally, there are the other questions about what I will call the middle level questions about interventions and the nature and drivers of interventions. I want to start first to thank Akin and Cassandra and all those who have spoken, in terms of, I think we are getting each other very clearly. And where I think we are getting each other was a significant question you posed at the end for me. The question about development as optimism. And then I'll come back to co-creation. And I think we need to, and Cassandra talked about social and political history too. So I think there are some things that we need to realize first, that there is a worldview about development hacking. And that worldview actually it's shaped by a cosmology of your very presence, your location, who you are. I think Africa, as an African, I believe I'm condemned to optimism. My Reverend Father said I shouldn't use the word condemn, I should use the word commission, but in French, it's je suis condamné. I think given the conditions of our colonial encounter, you cannot but be optimistic on this continent. If you are not optimistic, then you become cynical, you jump into that boat to cross, or you go away, or you do not want to do anything. So you become paralyzed by the nature of the problem. So the first perspective of development as optimism and development as opportunity is tied. There was a very interesting intellectual direction there as development as a work in progress in which the endpoints are infinitely open. That was one of the constructs that I used at the beginning here. And I think that gives us, as a people and a continent, a set of pathways beyond a single trajectory of working together with ourselves. And the optimism I have is that almost 70 years into the development, more than 70 years into the development agendas, and what we have come, we've gone here, we've come there, the institute and the group opens up the question again and demand our reflection and our engagement. That actually is a testament to our humanity in terms of endless curiosity, in terms of the refusal to be satisfied with what we are, and the opportunity to raise questions that lead to our actions. Now, let me tie that, Akin. You cannot escape. You cannot say, I'm only an academic. I think about these things and write about them without acting. Of course, you know Gramsci. You know that they are engaged intellectuals of both right and left. So I deny you that escape in telling you that these days we cannot but think to lead to action. We must plug ourselves in different aspects of change making or the creation and co-creation of our very realities. And that's a political decision. You could decide to be on the right, you could decide to be on the left, you could decide to be on the middle. All of these are actually the result of our epistemic capture by Western thinking, left, right, and center, ideologically. They are Western ideological concepts that have captured how we see and how we know. So that's another area of liberation that we most probably need in terms of our thinking. And that, again, will come with work from movements. I didn't talk about movements, Akin, and I didn't talk about ideologies, but I think our thinkers are not the only solvers. Policy actors are not the only solvers. Movements of ordinary people, of peasants, of workers, NSAS, and all of that are potential dynamic expressions of reaction to our realities. And therefore, I think that's a very, very important thing. Now, co-creation, I like the challenge around co-creation, but I think we should not assume in naivety that believes that everybody comes into the play. If you look again, social and political history, where in the history of humanity, as expressed by Western thought, I will say, because I want to have that caveat, that has shown us the coming together at the level of collective humanity in terms of working out a solution. You might say, well, you see that in our indigenous cultures, in small societies. It depends again on scale. It depends again on how you organize and manage society. I think the challenge, so that's very important. I think you moved us, and Prof. Ishola, you also moved us into that area. And I think I'm not going to be the person resolving a lot of your questions in terms of indicators of the Akin asked about that. When should we be talking about indicators? Yes, Akin, we should be talking about indicators, but indicators that hold leaders and hold our communities and our organizations accountable, that makes them accountable, that demands from them that whatever you promise, either in the political process or the economic process, then you must deliver. So that's one level about development indicators. Are they necessary? They are necessary, but they are limited. Every action is constrained within the guardrails that society, economy, and where you are and your location provides for you. And that's where, Cassandra, your point about the capitalist logic and your skepticism is very well taken. Until we break that logic, China has not broken it for us. Russia has not broken it for us. Some of us spent all our lives, being part of the Red Armies all over the continent when we were younger. And yet we saw the great betrayal. Another very interesting thing that you raised about higher education, about 10 years ago, I had to engage the Chinese. And I thought when the Chinese were going to enter the world stage large scale, they will bring to bear their own philosophies of knowledge and education that is anti-West. He said, I went to that meeting and they were talking about building 65 MITs. They were not talking about whatever it was that was a heritage of Chinese culture that could constitute the basis of transformation, both either in science, technology. So again, I think both our humanity, the expression of our humanity, unless we are now talking theologically about one day that we all go to heaven together, both our humanity and the expression of our humanity is a continuous work in progress. And that the optimism and hope is that as human beings, irrespective of the genocides, irrespective of the dissensions and the fractures in our society, there is the impulse towards getting it right. And that's an assumption, it's an axiomatic statement, not provable, Akin. It's an axiom that determines how I analyze and see the world. And it's a very interesting thing if you go back into anthropology and all of it, there are all kinds of conceptions, you see, the Rousseauian and all, again, Western thought, but even in our thinking, you have some of those elements. And then about culture and how culture and our superstructure is related to the conception of development, whether it is in Ubuntu, whether it is in Yoruba culture or Igbo culture, there's the concept of well-being, collective and individual well-being. And I think that is the key anchor of development, the notion of collective well-being and its tension with individual well-being and how every society, every generation. You see, Akin, you post very interesting question, you are Professor Ishola, and the way I will answer it is that it's not for me to answer. Every generation, every society at particular moments will resolve a specific set of problems and questions for itself. And it's the hope and the commitment to that belief that that resolution is unstoppable and that resolution will emerge that constitutes the reason why some of us have not committed suicide and are still living and engaging humanity. And it's also the reason why it's irrespective of, crises, disasters, and people struggle to live. You might say it's ideological. You might say it's theological. You might say it's spiritual. But it's perhaps one of the essence of the constitution of our humanity, the capacity and the vision and the ability to see beyond now and to see a future in which there's a possibility of the realization of our imagination and our vision. And so that for me is the way I'm framing that question. It's not an escape route. It's actually a genuine commitment to say, we've come this far. Look at this conversation we're having today. I was part of the Young Talks many years ago that talked with Tade, with Kudibo Noli, and Badi Onimode, and all of that, we all talked about this. Some of us have gone into conventional politics today. Some of us are somewhere else. But look at this platform that has been created for us to begin a process of remobilization, resensitization, and reignition of what constitutes our fundamental questions. We're not going to answer them, but I believe 100 flowers should bloom. And I believe we should create the conditions and the environment in which 100 flowers can bloom and 1,000 experimentations and innovation can occur. That in a kind of way will lead us towards resolving what constitutes the common good. And then about COVID-19, which Cassandra raised, I think it's a great opportunity. I think all the crisis in the world today is a great opportunity for us. I think many of the global players, and it happened at specific periods, during the Second World War, when that was when our struggle for decolonization in the global South occurred. Again, around the period of the crisis, some of the tigers and those who have been consistent. Consistency, my dear brother Ayo, it's not about technocracy. Consistency is about a sinew, a spinal cord of, and I don't want to use the word establishment, I don't want to go into class theory. I'm trying to avoid all those epistemic traps, but the spinal cord of mobilization, concentration, envisioning, and movement of people. Part of some of my big brothers, like Professor Onoli, and he's still writing on Facebook, will say the problem we have is because of petty bourgeois politics. That sounds like very stale and passé conversation. Yes, but what we are saying is every society, you saw that this guy, needs an establishment anchored in its people and cultures that actually co-leads and co-coordinates and co-creates with its people in a way that it leads them to their own realization of what has been orchestrated or what has been determined, or a balance of what has been determined, orchestrated, and agreed upon is then realized. So, okay, I'm being very slippery. And I'm being slippery because I think you need to have an open end. We're not Hegel here. We're not building systems. Hegel built his massive systems. Talcott Parsons built his systems. Marx built his systems. The thing about theoretical systems builders is that they build the systems and they themselves are outside of the systems conceptually and epistemologically. And in a funny kind of way, you need to be distant from. I don't want to build systems. I want to see it from the point of view of the interaction between agency, individual and collective agency, vision, imagination, resilience, and stamina to the working out of whatever that generation and that society claims as its own at that particular point. And I used to be more arrogant intellectually. I will not be that arrogant now to state a claim of what that should be. I can only be aspirational. I can only be optimistic. I can only be visionary, but I will not situate or locate myself in stating the claim for what that is. And that is another principles of co-creation that needs to deal with patriarchy, that needs to deal with class inequalities, that needs to deal with regional inequalities, ethnic inequalities, and all of these inequalities, fractures and divisions within society. I'll leave it like that. I have actually moved from the concrete to the more abstract, but I'll leave it like that.
Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. As I said earlier, this is a continuous process. We started last year. We are still as if we have not even started at all. The book we are trying to, produce might speak to some of these concerns, and we'll be very happy to also include you in the project. So, Prof, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You can't thank you enough for your time, for making yourself available for this very, very important symposium. We also thank you, Professor Dr. Akin-Aina from Edinburgh. Thank you very much. In a short time, you've been able to make yourself available. Dr. Cassandra Mactesian from Barriot, thank you so much also. We appreciate you. And we promise to carry you along in the process of developing the book. Tomorrow we'll continue with the workshop. Unfortunately, tomorrow will only be for the authors that have submitted their abstracts. So it's going to be a closed session tomorrow. We'll be reviewing the reflections in the abstract, and then so that we can, design the way to go in the coming months, because we're going to have a very big and inclusive workshop around November here in Lagos. As I said earlier, we'll carry everybody along, and then we also make this recording available on our website, on our YouTube channel, at the IADS University of Lagos here, so that the conversation can continue from there. So once again, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to everyone. We appreciate you. So we are so sorry for the issue of compromise that happened to our link. So what we have to do is to send a new link to all the authors against tomorrow. So please expect new links for tomorrow's session. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much, doctors. See you tomorrow.